We actually don't know whether there are productivity shortfalls when people work from home. The difficulty they face is there isn't very much data. What I've been saying to CEOs is you need more data because this is a big decision to make. You need to know more about your company, about how it works, about why it works. And in the book, Redesigning Work, I did give CEOs a model for how to move into hybrid work. And the argument I made is
every CEO says they want transformation, but most never touch the one thing that actually drives it: how work is designed and how culture is lived every day. So in this episode, I sit down with Lynda Gratton, London Business School professor, global thought leader, and author of Redesigning Work, as many other books, to share bold, practical moves that CEOs and leaders can use to rebuild clarity, shift culture, and unlock performance in a world that won't stop changing.
There is a new generation of CEOs that have got a lot of sensitivity around culture, who actually realize that stress is an issue and realize they've got to do something about it, have a sort of better sense of how do you make change happen.
From your research, what do you think are the forces that are reshaping how CEOs really should think about work today?
In the 20 years since I've been really looking at the future of work, these forces that are in play, one of them, of course, is technological forces. The second is
what do you see right now in terms of organization that really center, empower people to the extent that the organization flourish? What all of us can learn from those kind of organizations?
I've been thinking about that question myself, and I think there's three things that I see great CEOs doing who are people focused. The first is...
Hi everybody, welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leader Show. Today, I'm so excited to have with me somebody that I follow, somebody I trust, somebody that I really respect, as Lynda Gratton. Lynda is one of the foremost global thought leaders on the future of work, named by Business Thinkers 50 as one of the top 15 business thinkers and described as a rock star teacher. Lynda is a professor of management practice at London Business School, where she received the Teacher of the Year award and designs and directs the Future Work Elective, one of the school's most popular electives. Her research on hybrid work was featured as the cover article for Harvard Business Review in May 2021, and she explores issues of work, MIT's long column. Over a decade ago, Lynda founded HSM Advisory, which has supported more than 90 companies around the world to future-proof their business strategy. Her 11 books, including Redesigning Work and The 100 Years Life, has sold over 1 million copies and have been translated into more than 15 languages. Lynda also served as a fellow of the World Economic Forum and co-chaired WEF Council at Work, Wages and Job Creation. Lynda sat on the advisory board of Japan Prime Minister Abe and served on the advisory board of a number of global companies. So, Lynda, thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great, Lynda. I mean, when it comes to your story, your experience, honestly, when I was thinking in terms of what to ask, I have so many different thoughts and ideas, but clearly we cannot start without asking you, what does it mean really, future of work? And I would like to get the angle of the CEOs. In these shows, we talk with a lot of CEOs and people that are listening. So interesting, what's the implication for them? So if we look really at the bigger picture at the moment,
yeah,
and we're living really through one of the bigger shifts in the work in decades. From your research, what do you think are the forces that are reshaping how CEOs really should think about work today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for that question. Of course, that's a topic that's been top of my mind for more than 2 decades, actually. So let me just give you a quick overview about where we are. So in the 20 years since I've been really looking at the future of work, there are these forces that are in play. And let me just remind you what they are. One of them, of course, is technological forces. It's playing out constantly. The second is demographics. The book I wrote, The 100-Year Life, really focused on what happens when lots of people live to 100 in terms of working longer. And then the social trends. For example, women working has been really important. Quite a lot of our CEOs are now female. That wouldn't have happened even 10 years ago. So these are always in play. And then, every now and again, something else happens. So if you look at an unexpected event that is still in play, I would say that was the pandemic. I know we're way past the pandemic, but some of the experiments it set off, particularly about hybrid work, are still playing out for CEOs. They're still worrying about, should I have people in the office? Should I have them at home? And of course, right now, what's top of mind for many of them is external forces around politics, globalization, supply chains, and so on.
Yes.
But if I ask CEOs right now what's top of your mind, as I often do, it is generative AI. And I think that we've been astonished, certainly I've been astonished, at both the depth and the speed that generative AI is moving. CEOs around the world are making big bets. They're making big investments. That's not yet been seen in the productivity figures.
Yes.
And so obviously lots of CEOs are saying to me, Lynda, we've made these big investments, but it's not showing up in productivity. So those forces are really playing out, Andrea. And as you've said, and I think you're absolutely right, right now, they're working together. These are not separate forces. They work together. So the job of the CEO is extremely difficult. No surprise, perhaps, that whereas the CEO used to be a career CEO, they'd go from one CEO job to another. You just saw recently the research studies are showing that once you've been a CEO once, you only do it once. I mean, these are very, very tough jobs. And I'm fortunate and privileged enough to work with some CEOs, and I can see the sort of pressures they're under. And part of them is because the future's unpredictable, and yet their employees, the communities they lead, want some sort of sense of, what does it mean for me? What should I be doing?
And how can I contribute to that, right?
Yeah.
And I think what you are explaining is, I totally agree with that. And also I think is building on what you said, the implication of leaders, generally speaking, but clearly on CEOs, is the level of increased pressure that they have. Because in a moment of uncertainty and lack of clarity and, confusion to some extent in terms of, how to respond or address all the forces that come in their way, the level of pressure increases. And that's why for example, it's something I speak quite often about, is the fact that many CEOs are really struggling to cope with the role and the responsibility that comes with the role. It's been always difficult, of course.
Yeah.
But the level of pressure is clearly increasing because there is much more demand for their leadership. And what does it mean? And the implication of that is a question mark at the moment.
Can I just make a point on that, Andrea? Because I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I've just written a piece for, you mentioned earlier, my column in MIT, and the next one that's coming out is about leadership and CEOs specifically. And what I'm sort of observing, and I do mention, in more detail that in the column, is there is a new breed of CEO coming up. So I've been at London Business School now for 30 years. The CEO model used to be the sort of Jack Welch model, really tough, aggressive male, fire everybody.
Command and control at its finest, right?
And, at business schools, at London Business School, Wharton, Harvard, we've been saying to our prospective students for years, that's not going to work for you. And what I'm really proud and pleased about is that there is a new generation of CEOs who are coming out, and we're beginning to see them now. And I would say that their characteristics are, first of all, they've often been brought up in a multicultural background. So they've worked across countries. Some of them speak more than one language. They've worked in multicultural teams. So they've got a lot of sensitivity around culture. The second thing is they're really learning how to control their stress levels. So I was at a meeting recently with some CEOs, and the interviewer was asking each of them, how do you stay healthy? And every one of them had, they were boxing every morning, they were running, they were meditating, they were blah, blah, almost
they pay
everyone.
more attention, right?
Yeah. So we are now getting a generation of CEOs who actually realize that stress is an issue and realize they've got to do something about it. They also talk a lot more about their families than they used to do. And then finally, they've got to, I think, this new generation have a sort of better sense of how do you make change happen. They're realizing that, as you say, the command control, Andrea, the top down isn't going to be working for them so well. But at the same time, they're not naive that it's all bottom up. I mean, that also doesn't work. So I think they've been trained better. They are better at managing themselves in terms of their stress levels. And I'm very pleased to see them. And I felt very positive because, of course, these were some of my students. So, we trained some of these people 30 years ago, and they're now assuming major jobs. And it's very reassuring, actually, to feel that the new training that this group have got, both within organizations and at business schools, has really changed the way that they think about leadership.
Well done to you and all the leaders, thinking that way. And I can definitely see and experience every day what you said. I think we started to see that shift. And by the way, on the personal elements, it's interesting because in this show we interview, probably it was last year, a CEO of a very large global company based in the US, and it's not necessarily new generation CEO. It was more explaining and telling the story of when he spent so much years as a CEO before. Now I think he's retired or consulting, and it was really sharing how the the implication living a busy life of a CEO had on his family, not only on his health, but also on his family. And, I can started to see a lot of people coming at the end of their career starting to reflect more in terms of, I spent so much time at work and as a leader, as a CEO, etc. And unfortunately, I disregarded the most important thing. So I'm glad that you started to see that shift, because to me, then it's also connected to performance. If people don't feel better, they don't live better at home, they don't feel
Yeah.
better physically, etc., how can they really
Yeah.
perform as a leader?
Yeah. And the sort of role model you give others.
Exactly right. Great. So why don't we shift a little bit to one of your most important research that you have done? You have done so many researches and books, but one clearly is talking about work, redesigning work. And you describe breaking work into tasking and rebuilding around human energy. I really would like to hear more about this. So how can leaders really put that into action in their companies right now? So what does it mean, and then
Yeah.
how can make it real for people?
Well, thank you for the question. And actually, Redesigning Work was a book that I wrote right after the pandemic. So during the pandemic, I kept a diary. Here they all are. You can see them here. There's loads of them every day. So I really saw what was going on, and I could see that there were experiments that were being kicked off that would change the way that we work forever. And indeed, that has been the case. But what I began to realize is that two things were really important. One is that the focus on tasks and skills. So rather than thinking about a job, my encouragement for CEOs is to think about, what skills do you need? What are the tasks? What's the workflow? Because we started this program by talking about the forces that are changing the CEO's life, and one of those contextual forces is just a lot of churn, a lot of change. So just focusing on jobs and saying, oh, is the job changing, is a very inflexible way of thinking about the people in your organization. You really need to focus on what sort of tasks are they doing, what sort of skills do they need. And also, and I want to shout out an earlier book of mine, which I'm going to start. I'm going to shout out Hotspots. There we go. I just happen to have it sitting next to it because I'm rereading it, which is about cooperation. And in fact, the book that I've just finished, which you'll see coming out on the bookshelves in spring, in autumn of 2026, really comes back to some of those cooperation issues. So really what I realize about redesigning work is that leaders need to think about work itself, and redesigning work was about that, but they also need to think about the cooperative processes within the organization, because what makes great companies isn't individuals. It's about how those individuals work together. And of course, these days, about how they work with generative AI as well, which I'm increasingly thinking of as another, not another human, but another sort of capability.
It's another node. It's another node in the system, in the network.
It's another node in the system. So if you can get a combination of people who work with generative AI and work with each other and work together very well, you have a very accelerating creative cycle there.
Yeah, it makes totally sense. Have you noticed, you live and work in business, have you noticed massive or major changes since the pandemic in terms of how people work? Because really, we started to see, I mean, we all know the implication of post-COVID, and the positive things happen in terms of hybrid work and the flexibility of leaders. For example, something I see is at the moment is most of the CEOs, they're calling back their people. So what do you think is happening right now, and what will be happening in the future?
So what happens in organizations is that norms and unwritten rules get embedded, and you end up working in a way that doesn't always suit you, but there's no other way. And I always sort of felt that about work. I work a lot in Japan, and seeing every Japanese worker getting on a train every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and doing that long commute and then leaving you looked at that and you thought that's just not sustainable. I just, as a human, from just watching what another human, I always thought to myself, I could never do that. I wonder how they're able to do that and what it takes away from them. And so I think what the pandemic did is it gave people an alternative way of working, because half the population, and I wrote about this at the time, half the population started to do what I'm doing and perhaps what you're doing, which is they did things from home. This place you're seeing now is my home office in Primrose Hill in London. And people actually quite liked it. So the primary thing they liked about working from home is that they didn't have to do a commute. That was the primary thing. But then as time went on, people realized that being at home was quite isolating, that actually you were unlikely to be promoted because nobody could see you. And then organizations and CEOs said, well, let's just start coming back. Let's make sure that we've got some time together. And what we've got now is quite a lot of variety between deals. So, and I've written about this quite extensively. One deal is I want everybody back in the office all the time. And the investment banks who pay a lot, so that's the deal, say, I'm paying you a lot, you need to be back all the time. And if you don't like to be back all the time, please leave us, because guess what? It's a very tight labor market at the moment, and there's plenty of other people who'll do that job. So I don't, by the way, have any judgment about that. I think every CEO's job is to make sure that they're doing what's right for the business. And that's what they're believing. On the other hand, you have CEOs, even now, who are saying, we don't really need you at work very much in the office. We'd like you to work from home, particularly if you're in IT or doing a job which requires a high level of personal mastery. So we want you to come in occasionally. And then in the middle, you've got these sort of negotiations about how many hours, how many days back in the office. I actually thought we'd put that to bed. But actually, I was at a meeting of CEOs, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, and I had a lunchtime meeting where we were going to talk about generative AI. And within about 5 minutes, one of the CEOs said to me, Lynda, where are you on hybrid work right now? And I went, okay, so here we go. So it is a big conversation. And I get that. I mean, these are very important decisions. The CEO who says, I want everybody back in the office, some of their people are going to leave. Now, if it's their underperformers, well, that's fine. That's great. But if their high performers start leaving in an industry where high performers really make a difference, then that's not so good. So I think, CEOs are just sort of working it out. And the difficulty they face is there isn't very much data. So we actually don't know whether there are productivity shortfalls when people work from home. We don't really know whether being in an office where they're talking to each other all the time and distracted all the time, we don't know what
It's subjective. It's subjective, mostly subjective.
So what I've been saying to CEOs, and actually this Chief Human Resource Officer, which is one of the communities that I serve, is you need more data, because this is a big decision to make. You need to know more about your company, about how it works, about why it works. And in the book, Redesigning Work, I did give CEOs and CHROs a model for how to move into hybrid work, depending on the sort of work that people do, the tasks that they do. And the argument I made is there are some tasks that are best done at home, and there are some tasks that are best done cooperatively. Work through the sort of major tasks in your organization and then get a sense of what's going to work best for you. And some companies are indeed doing that. And that sort of logic, data-driven logic, rather than emotion, is, I think, a very sensible thing to do.
Yes, and I think is also very cyclical, meaning there are some moments where it's important to have people back in their offices, and other moments in the history of the life cycle of a business when it's less needed. To me, what comes to mind, a couple of things is, so one is something I've wrote about because I read an interesting article. We started to see a sort of double standard at work when it comes to flexibility, meaning some leaders, top leaders, but that's really true stories. They're having meetings from some nice resorts, in the Bahamas or somewhere else. And while their own people, they stay in the office. And I think it's the potential risk I see at the moment is creating, again, double standard at work. And we have seen double standard in different shape or form, but now apply to flexibility, meaning for those people, they can. Well,
Yeah.
flexibility applies. For other people, they cannot do it. That doesn't apply. So it's less driven by job role and task, as you said, which has to be, to me, the main criteria. And the other thing I read is, I don't know whether you came across the latest Microsoft Infinite Workday article and research, which is quite interesting. That just confirms again how much time really we all spend working, even when we are at home. So to me, these are the two potential risk or blind spot that CEOs might have when it comes to where you're working.
And I think it's a great debate to carry on having. And I'm always very happy to talk to CEOs about that, because they just have to work through their motivation, as you say, and work through what is it they're trying to achieve. Yeah.
Exactly. Great. So you mentioned before the 100-year life. So if we transition to career, and there are a lot of people in the audience, as you might expect. They are not necessarily CEOs yet, but they want to get to the top, or at least they're ambitious for a very valid reason. They want to think more about career, right? So in your book, you challenge traditional career paths. So what should really leaders do differently to prepare, their people? So CEOs to prepare their own people for their own career, but also for people they want to step up. Because if you say there is a different career path that might work, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience right now that would be interested to hear what is about. Lynda, tell us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. And The 100-Year Life was a very important book. In fact, the book I'm writing at the moment dives a bit more into what would you actually do, because everybody's asking me that question. Well, how do you do this? Just to give us a bit of historical background, organizations, institutions, educational institutions, pensions, were all based on a fundamental premise of the 3 stages of life. So full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement. And that worked until about the 1960s and the 1970s. It began to break down then. People weren't saving enough for their pensions pots were beginning to decrease, but that was not seen as a systemic problem. It was just seen as like a pension problem. What we're beginning to realize now is it's a systemic issue, and it's not just about pensions. It's also about people need to work longer. In my books, I'm recommending you really try and work as long as you can, and if it's into your 70s, it's into your 80s, then that's good, because good work is great, but of course you have to have good work. So you're looking absolutely terrified at this time, at this stage. You probably were okay about 70, but then I used 80 and you went, oh my God.
Right.
So how do you do that? Well, that's what my new book is about. Sadly, you'll have to wait another year to get it. But actually, I'm doing little teasers along the way. So if you go to my LinkedIn, you'll find little teasers. So what we're beginning to see is a breakdown in 2 sort of exciting ways. One is a sort of a vertical breakdown, which is to say we're going to do different things. We're not going to have 3 stages. We're going to have multiple stages. For example, I'm going to be a freelancer for some of it. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to take time out to learn. And then the other thing you get, which is what people are seeing later on in their careers, is it happens almost horizontally at one time. So you develop what you call a portfolio, where you say, I'm actually going to do all of these things at the same time. I'm going to go freelance. I'm going to have time off. So it's basically a much more flexible way of working. And the point I'm making in my new book is that we each have to build our own life. It's very hard to look at others and say, what does that mean? But what does that mean for CEOs specifically as they think about their talent strategies? Well, here's what I'm saying to CEOs right now. So as you thought about talent strategies, if you think about the talent strategy for the 3-stage model, it's the build and buy talent strategy, which is to say, I bring people in at the beginning of their life, I build them, and that's fine, or else I buy them. So at the age of 30 or 40 or 50, I buy them. I'm going to make suggestions that there are 2 other talent strategies that are going to be much more important for the future. One is borrow and one is bridge. And by the borrow strategy, I mean that you realize that there are going to be people out there who you really want, who don't want to work with you full time. It's the freelance market. And Dan Gerson, who was the CHRO of IBM, and I wrote a very important book, article for Harvard Business Review about freelancers. And we called it, People Want Your Work, but They Don't Want Your Job. And we actually uncovered really an astonishing trend of how often CEOs are turning to freelancers to run projects for them, to make big decisions rather than bringing them in full time. That works for them because they can get the most talented people. It works from the freelancer because one of the ways that you build value in your and mastery in your career is that you work across functions, and businesses. And so if, for example, one of the retail bank CHROs said to us, look, our bank is now a digital business. It's not really a retail bank anymore. It's a digital business. But everybody that we've built is being built with a retail banking mindset. So we actually have to bring freelancers in from other sectors, so for example, from tech companies, from pharmaceutical companies, from retail companies like Amazon or some of the big retailers, because they actually understand how to do digital in our sort of business. So I think that borrowing is going to be really important. And the fourth strategy, talent strategy, is about bridging, which is where you say, we need to move people across the organization. So we need to bridge from one type of job to another. And these horizontal movements are very important because if you take a look at how people learn, they learn through switching. Doing a side project, switching to another type of business within their own organization. So that's also very good. So I think the CEO needs to be a lot more creative and not just always be going back to the build and buy strategy, but also thinking more about the borrow and bridge strategy.
The most important point I think that you made, and I'm reflecting what you said, and I'm with you really. I think it's been always the idea of bringing experiences and skills from different industries and different companies, maybe at a temporary level, to build a capacity or capability inside, and then at some point transition maybe to a different model when your people are stepping up and learning. But as a theory, personally, I believe ideally is a good idea, but the reality of work right now is, given all the changes, and we'll come back soon to AI, but all the changes and all the trends that are developing so fast, it would be really difficult to start thinking today what's going to happen even in 2-3 years' time, what skills you in that time. So what you explain, I think, is not just the most flexible and smarter way, honestly, to build capability in your company, but I think it's probably the best one. That I can't see any other model at the moment that will work based on the interdependencies.
So I've been working with one of the big American companies recently with their talent team, and we just went through the build, buy, borrow, bridge model. It's quadrant, obviously. Yes. And just really focusing on the borrowing, the bridge, and saying, look, we're doing the build okay. We're doing the buy okay, but that's, it's hard just to buy people out. So let's really think about the borrow and bridge. And what they're beginning to realize is the build and buy brings stability, whereas the borrow and bridge brings flexibility. And you actually need both.
So speaking of people, you have studied and worked with so many companies. What do you see right now, in your experience, in terms of organizations that really are people-centered? They really empower people to the extent that the organization flourish, but also really you can see from not only when you are inside, from outside, how many efforts they put to put people at the core, and that is working. What can you learn from, what all of us can learn from those kind of organizations?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And thank you for encouraging us to sort of consider that. And I've been thinking about that question myself. And I think there's three things that I see great CEOs doing who are people focused. The first is they listen carefully. So, for example, we're working with a CEO at the moment from one of the UK's biggest companies, and they just ran what we call a jam, where they had 40,000 of their employees talking to each other about what they wanted the company to become. Wow. And the CEO was actually actively involved in that. And they listened really, really carefully to what they heard and were part of that conversation. So I think that's the first thing, they listen carefully. And not just to the same old people, but to a wide variety of people. I think the second thing is, and it comes back to the earlier point we made about redesigning work, is they get the deal clear. I don't think I think that when you accept a job for a company, the more you know in reality what the deal is, the better you can choose. And so I think it's absolutely incumbent on a CEO who wants to run a really big, talented company to say to their talented people, the ones that are in the company and ones that might join it, this is what the deal is. And, by that, I mean, this is what you can expect. This is what we're going to give you. But also, these are the accountabilities we're going to make. I was listening to a CEO recently talk about managing people. And what really I found very compelling about what they said is that they said, but people, we also have to we need to give people responsibility, but we also have to give them accountability. We need to tell them, this is what our expectations are of you. And I think that just helps people, because what it's doing in a way is creating not a parent-child, but an adult-to-adult relationship. Look, accountabilities based and responsibilities. And the third thing I would say, and this really comes out of some data that we're seeing from the tech company Culture Amp, which have got very, very good data sets. And what they've noticed is that when people say they're going to stay, so when your most talented people stay, what is it they're staying for? And they're staying because they feel that they're growing because they get exciting work. And that's really important. We forget that actually, if you're somebody who wants to build a flexible life, you've got to build mastery. You've got to have things that, what I call micro skills, things that you're really good at. And so you look to the company to say, am I learning? Am I growing? So that for me, and actually of the three that I've spoken of, listening carefully, naming the deal, this one about creating exciting work, I think currently is the most important one.
It is. It absolutely is. And, point about clarity, purpose, but I think for example, I'm a big fan of, and I keep saying this to my clients, is we should really go back to the idea of having fun at work. Everybody say, of course, everybody wants to have fun, but then the reality of work is not fun anymore, right? So, and maybe that is a good segue to a follow-up question I have, given that you touch on culture, even implicitly. But really, what do you believe, given all the experience that you have, what people can do on beyond what you already shared in terms of clarity, expectation, purpose, in order to build a strong culture, so people, can stick to the organization, given what you mentioned before, which I think is one of the major risks right now, people leaving organizations. What else we should consider so people can feel like, yes, I want to stay, I want to live here, I want to really contribute, but also I can perform here, because to me, culture isn't ever for performance. To me, doesn't exist culture if it's not related to business performance, because we are not a family, we're not in a community. So
well, I think cultures is just the water that we swim in, isn't it? In companies, it's the thing that we see, it's the norms, the expectations, the unwritten rules of the game. And I'm a psychologist, so when I think about culture, I think about, as you say, about a family. How does a family learn? Well, it just watches each other. So I think the greater CEOs at the moment are the ones that are being honest about themselves and honest about the situation, and are role modeling behaviors that they want others to engage with. And that's not easy. And it comes back to authenticity and the leader knowing who they are, which is a lot of the work that we do at London Business School, is about helping leaders work out who they are. But that's really important, because it's a very stressful job. It's not a job I could do, by the way. I could not be a CEO. I mean, I'm very happy to be a thought leader and tell others what to do, but I couldn't actually do it myself. I want to be clear about that. I'm too introverted, and there's a whole bunch of things that wouldn't make me a great CEO.
I would like to challenge that, maybe for another conversation.
Okay. But, when I look at the great CEOs that are coming up now, they're just sort of honest about the situation. They're not, and by that, and they're not overly pessimistic, because what we do know, and actually that's one of the reasons that I'm careful about why I wouldn't be a CEO, because I feel at the moment my realism is overwhelming me. There are moments I feel of real pessimism, but I think for the CEO, people want an optimistic view of the future. And that's always what I try to do in my own books. And the reason I think that's so important is from a psychological perspective. We know that pessimism closes down the parts of the brain that help you learn, that help you
Yes.
have fun. And so, if the CEO is pessimistic, then that's really terrible. That's not to say they shouldn't be realistic. So one of the CEOs I'm watching at the moment is the CEO of Rolls-Royce, and he's done a great job there. But when he came in, he said to the Rolls-Royce people, we are in a bad situation. This is a burning platform, but these are the three things that we need to do right now to make a difference. And I think it's a combination of naming the problem and then showing people how to get out of that problem that is very, very important. He was realistic, but he was also optimistic about how they could move forward. And indeed, the company has done very well recently.
Yeah. So I agree. And honestly, there is an issue with integrity, broadly speaking, in business. And integrity, in my view, is not about morality or ethics. Integrity in terms of that's what I say, that's what I do. Now, what I think I'm hearing a few times in leaders is there is a commitment to transparency and openness, but then the reality, the way how they communicate, the way they talk is not always consistent with that. So it remains as a principle, but then no specific behavior habit that bring that to life. But the point is really well made. I think it, to me, is an element, is an element of great leadership, but also build a culture of transparency and openness. I work with the CEO right now, and it's all about transparency. He lives transparency. So he lives and operates with transparency. And that makes it totally different in experience that actually the employees have working with him. And then leading to the next question. So you said before, you work so many years also with future leaders, London Business School, for example, people that maybe right now they were already, in the role of a CEO, in a position of a CEO. I'm interested to see how the personal identity of leaders shape the way how they lead right now.
It's a great question. And
by the way, the reason why I'm asking about identity, first of all, is such an interesting topic, and then you are a psychologist, of course, so you have a view. I interviewed Deborah Ancona. I don't know whether you know her.
Yes, of course I know. Yeah.
Deborah, we spoke a lot about the ghost, and my new book is about the identity with the CEO, implication identity to the lead. So so I'm just a little bit selfish, but I think it's an important element and topic.
The work that I'm doing at the moment is a sort of guided question. And the first question is, who am I? That's the very first question. And that's a fundamental question of identity. And what we know is the more we know who we are, the more able we are to be ourselves skillfully. And who we are, in my view, that there are three sort of dimensions that make up who we are. The first is our ancestors. So I've been through a very detailed process in the last couple of years to write stories of my life, to write stories of being me. And there's no question that my ancestors, even going back, 3 generations, I come from a family of washerwomen. Up until my grandmother's time, they were very poor women who washed laundry. And every now and again, every generation, one woman broke free. And that was my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother, and sort of, did something else. And so we have 3 generations of women. And that's fundamentally, I think about myself now as a washerwoman. I'm very, very hardworking. That's my ancestry. The second is your character, your personality. Are you introverted or extroverted? Do you enjoy? Do you have, openness to experience? What level of neuroticism do you have? I've come back to that as a psychologist. I let go of personality traits years ago because I just didn't think they were very cool. But actually, I've brought them back now because, if I look at myself, my key personality traits, which are openness to experience, is my number one trait, has absolutely made me who I am. And then the third is your workplace experiences, what you've done, the sort of jobs you've done, and there's 2 types of experience that really, I think, shape your character as a CEO. One is the switches that you made, what different companies, countries, And then the second is the side projects you work on. Because if you look at people's careers, and certainly this is true for me, it's the side projects that actually make you who you are. This is a point, of course, that Herminia Ibarra is always making in working her ideas on working identity, which is that you use side projects as a way of playing around with possible identities. So those three things: your ancestors, your character, your working identity, is, I think, really important, and it's important that we understand that, and that CEOs understand it. And certainly at London Business School and the CEO programs, the programs that we run for future CEOs, that's quite an important part. Because if you don't know that, because what I find really fascinating, and Andrea, you may feel the same, is that when you allow people to express themselves through their ancestry, through their character, through their work experience, then what you notice is they become much more in, themselves. So you get much more diversity within the CEO population. There was a time when CEOs were very much the same. They were male, they were highly ambitious, very competitive, probably pretty extrovert. But what you're seeing now is a huge diversity. If I look at the CEOs that I know, some of them are women, some are men, some are extroverts, some are introverts, some of them are, they're very different from each other. And I think that's wonderful, because it gives potential leaders, they can look at and say, okay, there's a role model. One of the challenges I realized from my age group, I'm now 70, is that when I joined one of the big consultancy practices at the age of 35, there were no senior women. When I joined London Business School, after that, there were no female professors. And so that was very hard for my generation to really understand how to be a woman. Whereas I think now, because there are so many more female CEOs and they're so different from each other. I mean, I love female CEOs, so I try and spend time with them just to get a sense of them. And they're very inspiring, because it shows to women, gosh, I could be that person.
You might not know that, or maybe you follow the show, but of course, but you don't necessarily track the interviews that we had. You might be surprised, but 70% of guests that we bring here are women, and are women with a CEO title. And it's so interesting to see their perspective. And to me, it's fascinating how that so many women now are stepping up and have been given the opportunity to lead. We're still far away from where we should be, but clearly it's changing. It's a possibility. It is.
I mean, my generation became the role models. If I'm, at London Business School now, the younger professors, female professors, say to me, "Lynda, you're a role model." And I find that sort of hard to believe. But of course, there's not that many female professors in the world who are in my age group, who so we are role models, and both role models for what they want to be and role models for what they don't want to be. Of course, role models work in both ways.
It's like an influencer, right? So whoever is able to influence people, it's a privilege, but also it's a responsibility for you bringing to others. So that leads me naturally to a question about you, Lynda, because you have such a really amazing career story. I mean, we said at the beginning, when we were talking about your story, but what has been the turning point for you? I mean, when has been the time where you said, okay, things are moving and I need to move in this direction, and that's where you are right now? What happened at the time? What was the turning point for you?
So I explored this for a year. I decided to stop writing books about companies and just started to think about what would be the wisdom that I would give others at this stage of my life. Because, of course, the marvelous thing about the 100-year life is that you've got a whole bunch of people in their 70s who have a great deal of experience and still very productive. And I think they're a very important group for the world. And I'm one of those people. I mean, there's others around as well who are very experienced now, and I'm pretty low ego, just trying to do the best for others. And what I realized is that, I never really had a plan. But what I do have, and it comes back to your earlier question about who I am, is I'm very open to experience. My husband calls it getting giddy. I just get very excited about things. And so for me, it's always the question. It's not that I'm driven by questions. So the question that drives me at the moment is, what advice would I give to somebody about how to build the sort of working life that they want? What would be, that's the question I'm asking right now. And so that just drives me on. But there's been other questions in my life, like how do you build? I was very interested in cooperation for years. Why is it that some places are very uncooperative? Why is it that some companies seem to really have this sort of glow of cooperation? I wrote quite a lot about that. So that's what I get driven by, not really visions of the future, but by questions.
Yeah, I would say probably your level of curiosity is so high that keep you so interested into what's happening in the world, which I don't think is a surprise based on the research you have done so far.
Thank you. Yeah.
Amazing. So, Lynda, it's been an amazing conversation, but I want to protect your time and the time of our listeners because I know you're writing a book. So I know it's a critical component of your current agenda. So, Lynda, where people should go if they want to know more about you? I mean, you are clearly well known.
Yeah. Well, two things really. Obviously, I have a website, www.lindagratton.com. And I have a LinkedIn, which I guess is also Lynda Gratton. I've got lots of LinkedIn followers. I tend to do, everything I do with regard to work, I post. So I have a column in the Times. I have a column at MIT. So yeah, just have a look at the website. But actually, LinkedIn is a more up-to-date version of who I am. And get ready for this whole ecosystem of ideas that are going to flood you about how to have a great 100-year life. And that you'll be hearing more of that actually in the months to come. And then the book will be out in September of next year.
Looking forward to it. So, Lynda, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an amazing, inspiring conversation.
Thank you, Andrea.